So we're pretty close to the end of 2024, and I thought it'd be fun to use this second channel, which I'm using for much more casual videos, to just talk about my favorite books that I read in 2024. With the exception of a few of these, I don't think any of them came out in 2024. Most of these were just older books that I finally got around to reading. I don't have a top 10 or anything like that. In fact, I just have this stack of books, and I'm just going to grab books from the stack and talk about them as they come so that it feels a little bit more spontaneous these days. So I guess the first book, which I actually finished last night, finally got all the way through, was Jaroslav Pelikan's Christian Doctrine and Modern Culture since 1700. Pelikan wrote this 5-volume history of Christian theology. I have read earlier volumes, but I had never read the 5th volume. This mostly focuses on sort of the fallout of the Enlightenment, the rise of idealism, things like that. It's not a balanced book by any means. It basically cares about things that were being done in the German academy and then how that trickled out into other parts of Europe, with a little bit of Russia, but it didn't seem to really care about sort of more grassroots movements that were happening in the United States. I mean, it does feel a little bit weird to write a book on Christian doctrine and modern culture and never talk about, say, Pentecostalism, which was a huge force starting in the 20th century and is a huge force today. So it just seems like there are gaps in this book. However, it's comprehensive. It's a delight to read. I think he makes academic writing actually quite a bit of fun without cheapening it. And I think it's going to be like this go-to reference for me for a very long time, along with those other volumes that are up on my shelf. If you're at all interested in the history of Christianity, even just from an academic point of view, not even someone who's practicing, then you might want to pick these up if you're interested in one of those more academic discussions of theology, rather than like pure history or social movements or something like that. But I mean, overall, really solid read. And I think that the criteria I'm using in this video, it's like, is this a book I could see myself reading again? And if the answer to that is yes, then I chose it as one of my top reads. If the answer was even a maybe, then I wouldn't choose it as a top read. So, Pelikan, Volume 5, top read of 2024. Coming up next, great. We have Elizabeth Anderson's Hijacked. How neoliberalism turned the work ethic against workers and how workers can take it back. This book is most interesting, to be honest, in the early discussions of John Locke and Jeremy Bentham. I found later chapters to be just less interesting, less engaging. But the basic idea of taking this one concept, like the work ethic, and just tracing its history through philosophy, I really like that approach to gaining traction on philosophical problems. I really like how Anderson does this. And in general, I think that Anderson is like a top-notch political philosopher working today. I loved her earlier book, Private Government. I taught a class on private government actually when I was still teaching at a university, and my students loved it too. So it was the kind of book that I could teach to intro students and they could get a ton out of it, while also it being really philosophically enriching and engaging for me. That's hard to do for introductory books. And it's mostly done because people are bad writers, not because it's an impossible challenge or something. If you're interested at all in like sort of issues, like the philosophical issues around work, about the work ethic, the morality of work, any of that stuff, then I think Anderson is someone to read. I would recommend Private Government more than I would recommend this book. Fair warning. But again, I know it's a book that I'm going to read again, so it's made it into the top reads. Or if I don't read it from cover to cover, I will at least be consulting it as needed for some projects that I have coming up. So very good book. Really excellent. Okay, the next book here is actually an honorable mention because I wanted to talk about this general category of philosophical biographies of philosophers. I read 3 philosophical biographies this year. So 2 of them are honorable mentions, and then one actually takes the crown. So the two honorable mentions are Philosopher of the Heart, biography of Soren Kierkegaard by Claire Carlyle. Got this from the library. I need to return it very soon. Solid biography. Since it's not the top pick, I'm not going to say much about it, but solid. Made me appreciate Kierkegaard more. It's what you want here. And then a new book out from Emily Herring, Herald of a Restless World, about Henri Bergson. And that, I think, was a great pick, or a great read, too. But the best philosophical biography I read this year was actually Sperber's Karl Marx, A 19th Century Life, which I read on an e-reader. So I don't have a picture of it to show you here, but you can imagine it right here by my head. One of the things that I think is really difficult to do when you're writing a biography of someone like Marx is to write it in such a way that you're not engaging in hagiography, that you're not writing the life of a saint or the life of the arch villain of history, depending on your political orientation and your assessment of work, of Marx's work. So I think Sperber took the right approach. His main viewpoint is Karl Marx is a 19th century intellectual engaged in 19th century political debates. And if you want to understand Marx, you don't understand him as a prophet. You don't understand him as the person who brought down Western civilization. You understand him as a particularly influential and oftentimes brilliant 19th century philosopher and economist and activist. It's the same approach that you should take when you read Darwin, when you read Nietzsche, when you read Freud. All people that we have a tendency to elevate into sort of great men of history. And, you know, I'm all for reading the great men of history, great women of history, great people of history, but there is no need to make things up when you're writing about them. And I have found when you read about Marx in particular, people have a tendency to be dishonest, and that's either in favor of Marx or against Marx. And I'm not saying I could be the adjudicator of all things about Marx, but you can read it. I mean, you can almost feel the dishonesty when you read some things about him, and it's kind of a turnoff. It's disgusting to read, and it insults the reader. My friend Steve, who I hope is watching this video, has said similar things, I think, about biographies of Ronald Reagan, because he's held up either as this great villain of an American president or the greatest president we've ever had. You end up writing a biography about the legend rather than a biography about the living person. And I don't read biographies to read legends. You know, if I want hagiography, like I mention this occasionally on the channel, it's not a big part of the content, so I don't bring it up very often, but I'm Eastern Orthodox. If I want to read a hagiography, I can read about the saints, right? We wrote 1 billion hagiographies in our history. I don't need it to be about Reagan or about Marx or about anybody. I've read plenty in my life. There's no point in me reading more. And then to dress it up in the trappings of an academic biography would be a travesty. But I'm talking about all the things that I dislike about certain kinds of biography and not talking about the Sperber biography. But I mean, I think it basically gives you a comprehensive view of Marx and his life and his work, his relationship to other thinkers at the time, Engels, but a whole lot more, to various political organizations, the sort of moves and contours of his personal life. Actually gives some of the story of his wife, for instance, who's a woman who could be almost entirely written out of history by some tellings. And importantly, it really situates him in the German university system, the young idealist or the young Hegelian movement, but there was the sort of young movement all across Europe. It just does a great job of situating them against there. So to the point where if you're interested in that, maybe you're going to end up reading Feuerbach or Bauer or any of these other intellectuals that Sperber mentions. I would say that the Sperber biography has now become one of my favorite biographies I've ever read. Biographies of philosophers, though, I still think Jennifer Burns' Ayn Rand, Goddess of the Market, is one of the best biographies I've read, but also the best biography of a philosopher, because Burns just is going into the archives. I mean, so does Sperber, but I mean, just Burns does all of the scholarly stuff that you need for a great biography. She's critical, she's piercing, but she's writing a personal story. But also, she just tells a good story. She has more of a narrative in a way that really made Rand feel like a character there. Sperber's lacks that a little bit, but I could see myself reading this again down the line. Or I would say almost definitely could see myself reading it again. So it makes it to the list. But the Herring and the Carlyle biographies of Bergson and Kierkegaard, very solid. I had them on my desk. I wanted to mention them, especially Herring, who's that book's new. So now would be a great time to buy it. If you want to see more biographies of philosophers, now would be a great time to buy Herring's book. It's still in hardback. I'll put a link down below to like Bookshop or something if people want to buy it. But yeah, all great books, all fantastic books. Okay, Steve, if you're watching, you're gonna hate me because the philosophy is continuing for a little bit. This book by Bob Pippin, The Culmination, which is about Heidegger's reading of Hegel. I know I'm gonna have to read this book again because I am not smart enough for this book right now. I don't know enough Hegel and I don't know enough Heidegger, and yet it really is about like the fate of philosophy. Like, what's the point of all this stuff that we're doing? Like, what the hell are we spending our time on? That is such a big deal if you're like me and you care about philosophy. So Pippin has sort of distinguished himself for a long time in the history of, in the modern academy as being one of the premier Anglophone interpreters of Hegel. Maybe along with Pinkard, maybe you'd make the argument for Brandom, but Pippin's one of them. And famously, one of the great critics of Hegel, one of the great interpreters and critics of Hegel is Martin Heidegger. And the problem that Pippin sets out at the beginning of the book is basically, is Heidegger's critique of Hegel correct? And Pippin comes to the conclusion, roughly, that it is. That actually, Hegel succeeds in the culmination of philosophy where logic and knowing end up being essentially identical to being. And then Heidegger basically looks at it and says, so what? There's still this big sort of existential question about the meaning of me, the meaning of my being, or something like that. I'm sure people who know Heidegger and Hegel better could start correcting me already. And that's a kind of powerful critique because it just questions the whole enterprise. It questions the whole point of what we're doing. And I say this as an admirer of Hegel. And Pippin came to the conclusion that Heidegger was right. So it shows also a remarkable amount of intellectual honesty on his part because he is able to admit that this great philosopher that he spent his entire life studying might have been all for naught. That actually Heidegger was the one who opened up sort of the new problem, which was actually ultimately the real problem that we in philosophy needed to be dealing with. I know I'm going to have to read it. I'm probably going to read it next year. I might even read it in the first couple of months of next year. Yeah. In fact, on that note, we'll talk about some of my reading goals for next year at the end of this video. So we'll see. Okay. We finally have some fiction. I'm going to talk about a couple of novels. So one of these I read in 2023, right at the end, but then I finished the series in 2024. So I'll just hold up one of these. It is Bernard Cornwell's The Winter King trilogy. It's sort of his Arthur trilogy, his King Arthur stuff. I love King Arthur stories. I love Arthuriana. And I loved Cornwell's particular take on it because he writes it like historical fiction. He basically says, if there were a warlord-like character like Arthur, roughly what would he have looked like, given what we know about the history of England or Britain at the time, about the religion of Britain, and etc. And he writes these great afterwards where he explains some of the choices he's made, including anachronisms, like the inclusion of Merlin. Merlin particularly seems to be like a later accretion. I think Lancelot is also like that in the Arthurian legend. I've never read The Matter of Britain, so my cred as a true Arthur fan is pretty low. And still to this day, my favorite reading of Arthur is T.H. White, the Once and Future King. But these books, they hold their own. And I think one of these days, it's not going to be next year, but I think maybe in a year or two, I am going to do a systematic read of King Arthur, of sort of Arthurian legends. And I'm going to talk about, go back to the historical stuff, also early retellings, whatever we can get our hands on, read Mallory again, read T.H. White, read Cornwell, but also read a bunch of the stuff that like in the 20th century was published that I think a lot of it's out of print, honestly. My friend Bridger at the Library Ladder has a great couple of videos about this, and I probably want to read all of those too. I'm going to be too busy next year, so I'm not going to get around to it, but I thought it would be a lot of fun to revisit those along with my big systematic reread of King Arthur stuff. So that is going to come up soon. Character work there, absolutely great. I actually like the fact that Arthur is not the narrator in that. I think it's actually really helpful when you're writing about a legendary character like this to give yourself some distance from Arthur and actually put everything in the mind of, or the viewpoint of another character who admires Arthur, but also has to come and see him as a human being. I think that's a powerful narrative technique. I think it's hard probably to write a story that's deep in the mind of Arthur, given just how legendary he is. It would be like writing biblical fiction and you want to write about Jesus and you decide to have him as a main viewpoint character. It almost like gives the game away in your novel. So writing from someone else's point of view opens up more ambiguities in the text. And there's already a ton of ambiguity about whether or not magic is real and stuff. I mean, I think the way you read Cornwell here is that magic's not real in these books. It is all superstition. And the druids can't do anything. And the hopeful ending you might get out of these books then is actually just false hope. I think that's the right reading. So I read them more like historical fiction than like fantasy, but I like the way he plays with the ambiguity because he's sticking to the point of view of certain characters, and that works really well. So Bernard Cornwell, great series. Highly recommend it for fantasy fans who finally want to start reading historical fiction, which I'm kind of of the belief that more people who read fantasy should actually be reading a lot of historical fiction because it's good. It scratches the same itch as a lot of fantasy books, unless you're just really into like really mechanistic magic systems. And honestly, a lot of it's better written than a lot of fantasy novels. So you'd actually be reading books that are more enjoyable. So give that a shot. Okay, if it weren't for the fact that I read a different novel this year, there's one novel that we're going to talk about today still. If it weren't for that other novel, this book would be my favorite novel of the year. And that is John le Carré's The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, which was my first experience with John le Carré. I had bought a bunch of these thinking I should read them. And I always told myself, though, that spy fiction was going to be cheap, like easy thrills or something. I don't know why I let myself believe this, because I read fantasy novels too, and you could make the same critique of fantasy and science fiction a lot of the time. I mean, look, as much as science fiction like want to hold itself up like this, a lot of it is not sort of deeply intellectual. Some of it is, but not a lot. It's not all Gene Wolfe, right? So I don't know. I just kept saying, well, I'll read le Carré. But finally I was like, you know what? I'll just read it. Maybe it'll just be fun. This guy is an amazing writer. He's just like, he is a really great storyteller. There are moral complexities to the story that actually make it interesting. They're put through a heavy personal lens. You actually care about the main character, which is a non-trivial problem in a lot of fiction these days, is actually to write a main character that you give a damn about. Le Carré did a great job. I mean, and it seems like he does a great job. I'm reading Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy right now. But I paused it to read some other stuff for a little while to finish out the year. So I don't know if this is the best of le Carré. I have heard that A Perfect Spy is his best novel. I'm going to read all of the other le Carré that I own next year as part of my reading projects, but that's a spoiler. We will talk about those reading projects in just a moment. Okay, 3 more books to get through before we talk about those reading projects. 2 more works of philosophy. Okay, this one is Brian Leiter's Nietzsche on Morality. I've been trying to work on an explainer video about Nietzsche over on my main channel, sort of a Nietzsche an in-depth explanation kind of video, like what I did with Stoicism or recently about Aristotle's Ethics. I'm doing it out of a sense of completeness and a sense of duty, because I feel like if you're doing these mostly ethically oriented philosophies, you need to talk about the greatest critic of morality in the 20th century, or the 19th century, sorry, and that would be Nietzsche. But reading Nietzsche, he's heavily unsystematic. He's invigorating to read, like he's fun to read, but it's really hard to give a systematic interpretation of what he believed, because he writes in such a scattershot way. Leiter has been my guide there. I loved this book from Brian Leiter. If you are a reader of Nietzsche and you like the clarity that especially people who've been trained in analytic philosophy can bring, then the Leiter book is great. Not much else to say from it. Might give away too much of what I'm going to do in that Nietzsche video over on the main channel, hopefully in January, maybe February. Those take a while. But yeah, I'm really happy with that book. And I know I'm going to have to read it again in January, probably, as I finish up my script for my Nietzsche video. So, top read. This shouldn't be a surprise, this book, because I love this book so much. It's one of my favorite books, but it's Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. I read it for a 7th time this year, and I know I will read it at least 10 times before I die, and that's a modest estimate. I've read it 7 times in 10 years, and I was rereading it for a read along on my Substack, where we read philosophy and sort of philosophical fiction together, and I still get stuff out of it, and I know specific areas of the book now that I still don't quite understand, and that I'm going to have to really spend a lot of time figuring out. Aristotle on voluntary action. That's the next step, to understand Aristotle on voluntary action. It's a gap in my understanding of the text, which I feel like is eventually going to get really into Aristotle's theory of the soul. And so I'm going to have to expand out from the Nicomachean Ethics there to learn about that. I'm not doing this in 2025, but maybe in 2026 might be the read all of Aristotle year. That might be the big project of 2025. We will see. If you want my thoughts on that, all those posts on my Substack are free. I'll post a link down below if you want to read them, and just, join along in future read-alongs too. But let's talk about my favorite novel of the year. And I didn't intend for this to be climactic and have it at the end, but here it is. And that is Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel. I read it right at the beginning of the year. Mantel is like almost instantly one of my favorite writers now. This is a book that is all about Thomas Cromwell serving King Henry VIII, as he is struggling with things about the Reformation, about political upheaval, but really mostly about having a male heir. And Cromwell is sort of his professional leg breaker, and ends up being this kind of fetch me boy for King Henry VIII, and ends up doing a lot of kind of despicable stuff throughout the book. And yet you find him incredibly sympathetic most of the time. You almost sympathize him too when he's talking to Thomas More, and you do sympathize with More at the end of the book, certainly. It's a cascade of downfalls, and that seems to be the whole series. And you know where it's heading. If you know anything about history, you know where it's heading. And yet, Mantel makes you want to keep reading, even though it's all been written, right? So to speak. This was a thing I used to think about historical fiction actually for a long time, was it's all been written in the sense, sort of in the great book of history, right? Why do I need to read historical fiction then? And it turns out that actually that gets it completely wrong when you're thinking about historical fiction. Even if you know the bare facts, the historical fiction's writer's sort of goal is to tell a great story there that isn't just the reporting of the facts, and make you care about the people in a really direct way. And Mantel does that better than anybody, I think, that I've read. She's also just an amazing prose stylist. She is just one hell of a writer. She's a master. She's a master. We're all amateurs compared to Mantel. I am a drooling toddler when I try to write compared to Mantel. And I think that's important to actually recognize, right? Like I have something to aspire to because I want to be a tenth as good as Mantell in my writing. I would love that. Spectacular book. Everything about it's perfect. I actually don't think I have a single criticism of Wolf Hall. I've gotten a few other people to read it, and they have been like, slow getting into it, but once they get into it, they love it. And all I can say is, of course, because it's perfect. Let me go grab my notebook, and I'll talk about my reading projects for 2025. Okay, so I went and just got my my notebook here, and I want to talk about what I plan on reading in 2025. This might not be exhaustive, and things change, but I'm just trying to be more intentional about the sort of stuff that I read next year, to make sure that I'm reading good stuff, to make sure that I'm both making sure that I'm finally getting around to some of those books I've been meaning to read, also reading a little more widely, and doing some more systematic reading projects, which is what I've been trying to do a little bit more in my reading. So here's what I have. I have 100 things written on this list. Now, 40 something of those are Platonic dialogues, because I'm going to read the complete works of Plato in 2025. You can get this great Hackett hardcover book that I highly recommend. It's like $60. You get everything from Plato in a decent translation. You also get all of the dialogues that were attributed to Plato in antiquity, and I like that Hackett actually includes those. I'm going to read them all because they would have been of historical import as well. When I'm also thinking about big philosophy books that I want to read, in addition to some stuff for Nietzsche, I'm going to be reading The Phenomenology of Spirit again, Plotinus's Enneads, and Spinoza's Ethics. I'm going to be writing about those on my Substack, over on a little sub blog of it called The Plot. I'll just be plodding along throughout the year on those three kind of big systematic books. I decided that 2024 was going to be the year that I conquered some of those systematic books where you really have to comprehend the whole in order to understand any of the parts. And, going to make some real progress to it. I'm committed to that. I am also going to reread Wolf Hall and the rest of the Cromwell trilogy. I'm doing that along with another Substacker named Simon Hazel, I believe is his last name. He has a Substack called Footnotes and Tangents where he does these slow reads of big books like Wolf Hall, also War and Peace, a few other things. So I'm gonna read those on his schedule, and just savoring those books. Now that I've read them and loved them, I can now savor them again, and that's how much I love them. I'm reading them that quickly, even a year afterward or a couple months afterward. My friend Jimmy and I are going to read all of In Search of Lost Time by Proust. So that's 7 books. I am also going to be reading all of the Le Carré novels that I own, which I believe I own 8 more of them. So I will read 8 more, and they're all in those Penguin Classic hardbacks that you have to get from the UK, which I love that edition. I try not to care about editions too much, but I love them a lot. And so I'm going to read all of Le Carré that I own. I'm going to read a couple of David Mitchell novels that I haven't read before. In particular, The Bone Clocks is the one on my list. So I'm going to read The Bone Clocks. And I think there might be 1 or 2 else on the list, but there's no need to get every single title. I'm going to read 3 novels by Mishima. Sun and Steel, Beautiful Star, and Confessions of a Mask. I'm going to read Paradise Lost again. I'm going to read Memoirs of Hadrian. I am going to read all of the Le Guin novels that I haven't read before. Those, there's not a ton of them, I think, and I won't be reading the stuff that was written exclusively for kids, excluding, I will read any of the Wizardverse stuff, though I think I've read all of those. But, the is it Cat Wings? She has like a series about cats. I'm probably not going to read that. I plan to read those with my son once he's a little bit older, but I won't be reading there. So basically it's stuff that's from the Library of America. I'll be reading the Library of America volumes of Le Guin, but skipping the novels that I've read, some of them multiple times. I'm going to read Maximus the Confessor's Ambigua 1 and Ambigua 2. If you know anything about Eastern Orthodox patristic theology, it's an important set of books. I'm going to read the Odyssey and the Iliad next year. I've read them before, but I wanted to revisit them. Same with the Divine Comedy. I'm going to reread Moby Dick, Borges' Ficciones, and then I'm going to read the Expanse series as like a fun thing to do. And then that actually brings me up to 98 books. And so I've left the last two kind of open still. And what's important about all of these books is that I own all of them. Many of them I've read before, not all of them, but many I've read before. Next year, I'm sort of informally reading what I own. I've told my wife I will only buy new books if I need them for research for something I'm doing on the main channel. For instance, for some of those explainers, or if it's something for Substack, it's something like that. Do I need them for what is actually my job? But all this stuff is just for fun. That's just part of my sort of general intellectual life that I'm trying to live in this crazy world. All of that is stuff that I already own, because I spend a lot of money on books and I don't read every book that I buy by far. So I'm taking a bit of a break from buying books. Some publishers send me books. That's great. That will help me get my fix, I guess. But I'm not buying new books next year, really. And I'm going to focus on reading what I own. That's the big narrative for next year. All right, cool. So those are my favorite reads from 2024. It's what I'm going to read in 2025. If I do this at the end of 2025, maybe you can all mock me because I didn't read any of the books that I put on my list. We shall see. All right. This has been fun. I would love to hear about your reading plans for next year down in the comments, or your favorite books that you read down below. Just let me know. And I'll see you next time.